Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Eesha Pandit, and I will be one of your hosts for this webinar today. I would like to start by acknowledging the ancestral lands on which this event is taking place. We acknowledge the land, waterways, and airways of the many First Nations people on which we work, study, live, and gather for this event, including the traditional custodians of the Lenape, Aktapa, Karankawa, Dharawal, and Kulin nations, Sana as well. We would like to pay our respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. We would like to pay our respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may have joined us today. We're here in Australia, but many of you are in the US, and perhaps there are some of you from other parts. I also want to take a moment to remember that, there's a lot going on, and to honor the people who we've lost in this terrible pandemic, and all of the people who are suffering, and for many of us, they're our loved ones, so we suffer with them. So I hope you'll take a minute in letting me honor them as well. Having said that, this webinar series has certainly helped me to continue through many of the trials that the last year and a half have brought. It's given me a great deal of focus and inspiration. We've called it the Educate, Organize, Resist webinar series, and it comes out of my research on transnational resistance to Hindutva in the Indian diaspora. Again, I'm Eesha Pandit, and I'm an academic at the University of Newcastle. This series, very briefly, invites activists and scholars from across the Indian diaspora to dialogue on the challenges and possibilities of contemporary activism for human rights, democracy, social justice, and peace in the Indian diaspora. We've had two speakers already in this webinar series, Dr. Biju Matthew, three, Dr. Radha D'Souza and Dr. Adrija Day, two webinars, who have shared their wealth of knowledge and strategies in mobilizing both street and online protest, political advocacy, transnational coalition building, and activist media work in resisting Hindu nationalism. And today, our speakers are going to talk to us about the educational component of resistance. And as an educator myself, I've been looking forward to this webinar for a very long time, and you're going to hear me say how excited I am more than once in this introduction, so please bear with me. To return to this overview of our webinar series, our goal is to learn from present as well as past mobilizations and sites of resistance against the forces of colonialism, imperialism, and ethno-religious nationalism, with a focus on Hindu nationalism or Hindutva in the Indian diaspora. Now, for those of you who may not be so familiar with what we mean by Hindutva or Hindu nationalism, this is a very brief overview and most incomplete. Hindu nationalism is essentially a supremacist ideology with elements of casteism, patriarchy, religious intolerance, racism, and violent nationalism, to name just a few. As with all supremacist discourses, this is a discourse which is replete with social Darwinism, or the idea of the survival of the fittest, and it valorizes an idealized, mythical, Brahminical Hindu past. And so this idea, they very much want social change, just like the rest of us, but their idea of change is premised on this mythical Brahminical Hindu past. The movement which espouses this ideology is 100 years old. It was founded by the RSS, or the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the National Volunteer Corps in English, which was founded in 1925 and heavily influenced by the European fascists of that time, most notably Mussolini in Italy Mussolini in Italy and Hitler in Germany. This is a highly organized movement, highly structured, both in India and abroad. It has many organizations and groups that make up the Sangh Parivar, as they're often referred to. But you may hear our speakers also, of course, refer to the political party that currently represents the Sangh, which is the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is the party led by current Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who is a lifelong member of the RSS. He grew up in the RSS. He played a key role as a grassroots RSS activist in the destruction of the Babri Masjid in Ayodhya. And of course, he was the chief minister of Gujarat during the 2002 genocide that saw thousands of Muslims systematically massacred and hundreds of thousands permanently displaced. When we look at transnational Hindutva in a global context, very briefly, again, they're highly organized, highly structured in their operations. The core bodies, the two core organizations you should know about are the HSS and the VHP, so the Hindu Swayam Sevak Sangh, the Hindu Volunteer Corps, which is very closely linked to the RSS, and the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, or the World Hindu Council. A third key organization in transnational Hindutva is, of course, Seva International, which is the social service wing of the Sangh Parivar, and they have been in the news recently. I won't go into that, but lots for people to read up on if you'd like to learn more about that. I'd also like to take a minute to pay tribute to my friend and comrade, Dr. Aziz Chaudhry, who passed away last week. Aziz, in short, was the inspiration for this research and for this webinar series. So I hope you'll allow me to share a little bit about how his work has shared what we're about to talk about today. Aziz worked with anti-colonial, feminist, anti-racist, indigenous, immigrant, migrant, and working class struggles for the last 4 or 5 decades. And he has left us a body of work that highlights the learning and radical imaginations that can be found in social movements and other collective sites of struggle. Through his scholarship, he showed that change is mainly driven by ordinary people consciously organizing, learning, and creating knowledge together to understand the workings of hegemonic power and knowledge, and to take steps to bring about social change. I encountered Aziz's work about 15 years ago, when I already considered myself an activist and an activist scholar, but his work challenged me in many ways, not only in how I thought about what it means to bring people together for social change, but also what it means to be part of the corporate settler academy today. There are many lessons. I hope that, if you're interested, you'll find his work all over the internet, not just these books that I'm sharing with you on the screen. But I think perhaps one lesson that is most relevant for us today is what he had to say about historical amnesia in his book, Learning Activism, right? And he wrote that in the absence of histories which document radical struggles from below, it becomes possible to make ahistorical and depoliticized assertions about the extent to which we have made progress as a society, whether it's towards human rights or social justice or sustainability. And the second lesson I'd like to share with you is the imperative nature not just of struggles by historically oppressed groups, but their struggles to democratize knowledge, their knowledge traditions that have been historically excluded and delegitimized. And the academy has played a central role in that dynamic. And this was what Aziz's work was all about, to decolonize and democratize the academy, and for us to engage with different forms of knowledge that could be considered valuable and legitimate, as well as multiple ways of knowing. And that's what we're going to talk about today as well, when we listen to Sangeeta and Eesha, who are two critical educators that I highly respect. So thank you, Aziz. You and your work will always be with us. And I can't think of a better way to honor Aziz today than with the conversation we're about to have about educating for solidarity and social justice. Not only do we have our key speakers today, but we also have several people in the audience with a great deal of experience and knowledge in this field. Yeah, so the vast majority of you have been doing this work for a long time. And so I'm really looking forward to a rich exchange, not only about what works, but what challenges we continue to face, what tensions we have to navigate. So thank you so much for joining us today. And to talk about what we can learn in this struggle and what it means to educate for solidarity and social transformation. As all of you know, we have a long, rich tradition of anti-oppression education in India. And Savitribai Phule's name always comes up in this context, so I honor her and her work as well. And now to introduce our wonderful speakers. Sangeeta Kamat is Professor of International Development Education at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She is a founder member of the Youth Solidarity Summers that were run as a volunteer collective in the 90s in New York. She is also a member of India Civil Watch International, the Alternative Project, which is a recently formed collective of critical educators who are raising questions about education justice. If you're not familiar with them, I hope you will look at the website and get to know more about their work. And INSAF, International Solidarity for Academic Freedom in India. Her scholarship encompasses neoliberalism in the development sector, the NGOization of social movements in India, and I always go to her work when I want to talk about the negative impacts of the privatization of education, and particularly the ways in which the growth of multinational edu businesses have had on equity and social justice in India. Today, we will hear from Sangeeta also about her decade-long, I think more than a decade actually, her work on the spread and influence of Hindu nationalism in the USA. Her most recent work has highlighted the connections between anti-Black, anti-Asian racism and casteism in the USA. And you can see some of this work in a recent talk on the UMass Vimeo Equity and Inclusion channel. So welcome, Sangeeta. Welcome also to Eesha Pandit, who is a co-founder of South Asian Youth in Houston Unite, or SAYHU. She's also a co-founder of the Center for Advancing Innovative Policy and a member of the Krunk Feminist Collective. She has led policy program and communication work to help shape movements for human rights, reproductive justice, and to stop violence against women for over a decade. She has worked with the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard University and the Amnesty International USA Women's Rights Programs. She is a graduate of Mount Holyoke College and the University of Chicago. And her work in everything that she does is shaped by the premise that everyone should have the right to participate in determining how we're governed, or rather how we govern ourselves. So this idea of education for democracy is intrinsically connected, I think, to what we're going to talk about today. Eesha is also a prolific writer and commentator, and you can find some of her work, her blogging work at feministing.com. Last but not the least, some housekeeping before we get started. This is a webinar, not a Zoom meeting, and that means that attendee mics and cameras are currently turned off. If you have a question, we'll turn your camera and sound on, and you can then ask your question. But of course, you can choose to keep your camera off because we are recording this event and it will be shared publicly at some point. For the same reason, if you would like to remain your question to remain anonymous, please feel free to say so in the Q&A forum, and Mudit or I will ask the question instead. So to repeat, this webinar is being recorded. So if you'd like to protect your privacy, please keep your camera off. And we will share the recording at some point after it's been edited on our Educate, Organize, Resist YouTube channel. It is not being live streamed on Facebook, but people can still join via the registration link. So if you have anyone trying to join at the last minute, do please ask them to register and we'll let them in. We will go for about 90 minutes. Please feel free to start asking your questions right away. If you have questions for our guests, please type them in the Q&A forum, and you can, of course, continue to have a discussion in the chat forum for everything else. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. And over to you, Sangeeta and Eesha. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nisha. And I think as we've decided, I think I'm going to start us off on the conversation. And then Eesha is going to sort of follow on, from me. And I'm really looking forward to a good conversation. One of my colleagues, friends from the very early days, of the first days of organizing, is also on this. She's joined the webinar. She's Mona Chopra is also here, and I'm really delighted that she's able to join. What I'm going to do is sort of give a overview of and some of the highlights of the Youth Solidarity Summer, and really, leave some of the things that I want to bring up, some of the questions and issues around challenges or the ways in which we sort of, things shifted, etc. I want to kind of leave that for later after Eesha's presentation for more, for a more open Q&A and discussion. The Youth Solidarity Summer, the beginnings of Youth Solidarity Summer, I would say, is really, was at the South Asia Madison conference. Interestingly, it was at an academic conference, but at an academic conference that I think many of us had really turned into a place as a certain kind of a gathering place for progressives, for left South Asian scholar activists. And here we sort of South Asia Madison Conference became a place sort of to meet annually and, be with friends on panels. And so, there was a certain level of trust. And this is where then FOIL got formed, the Forum of Indian Leftists, right? Over, several drinks one evening is when we came up with the idea of sort of forming FOIL as a network. And we really were also brainstorming then many ideas at the South Asia Madison Conference, sort of, in the evenings when we would sort of get together about saying, what is it that we can do as, a certain kind of critical mass of progressives in the US. What is it that we can sort of do, here specifically in the context of, I think it was also very soon after Babri Masjid that happened. And we could see sort of the growth of the right, of the Hindu right here in this country. And we were like, what is it that we could sort of bring to the, to the table? And as someone in education, to me, a summer program seemed critically important. It was something that I sort of, we knew what the other side was doing, right? We knew, we knew about the Gita reading sessions for young people, that the Hindu right was organizing summer schools for the young generation. And so you could also, we very quickly understood that the second generation were getting a very skewed idea of India through their parents, right? And that their search for a positive identity in the US, the Hindu right was sort of feeding off that quest for a positive identity, right? So ideas of greatness, of Hindu dharma, of Hindu religion, equating Hindu religion with Indian culture, right? And so really it was these very traditional religious cultural spaces, were the only ways it appeared for the young generation to be part of something called Indian. Right. And so YSS really emerged as a very direct intervention to counter what the Hindu right offered, right? To offer it in its place an alternative, right? For those who would be searching for something progressive, for something better aligned to their sense of justice, to to engage in critical inquiry, to those who would want to have a more complex, historically informed idea of India, of the syncretism of India and diversity. And so we were really wanting to kind of disrupt sort of, what we could see parents were passing down, and sort of the community sort of programs that these young, the second generation youth were part of, were really sort of, what they were getting was really a very ahistorical portrait of India, right? And this is very much a reflection of those who had immigrated in the 60s and 70s from India. They were very much the professional class, right? Doctors and engineers, again, very different from the Bangladeshi and Pakistani migration to the US, right? Which again, as recent immigrants ourselves to the US, as international students in the US, these were things we were also just, learning about, right? And seeing the kind of divergences and wanting to kind of bring that, to the surface, right? Rather than the Indian American sort of professional migrant sort of standing in for, all of South Asia, and really sort of, wanting to complicate that picture. And so YSS was conceptualized as a direct intervention into this apolitical conservative space that appeared to be the only available diasporic space for the second generation Indian American. Another aspect that we realized quite early on is that the second generation youth who wish to rediscover their identities, to do progressive work, they would often also then go to India for a summer or take a gap year. They would then end up working with very mainstream NGOs. They would end up working with even soft Hindutva type of NGOs, or even very explicitly Hindutva NGOs, not quite recognizing sort of, again, the rich sort of, kind of political work and grassroots organizing and activism that was very much that's part of Indian society and Indian politics. And all of us here were connected in some way or another to activists and grassroots movement organizations back in India, right? And as well as in South Asia. Those were, there were organizations and activists working on land rights, tribal forest rights, fisher folk struggles, anti-mining, the big dams and displacement kinds of protests and movements. The Narmada Bachao Andolan was like the big, an international anti-dam movement that, an anti-dam movement that had gotten international presence. And so all of these different struggles that we were aware of, and we were saying, how do we sort of then be sort of a node to connect the young South Asian Americans to be actually working with these grassroots organizations and activists, right? And that we could actually help make those connections. And so all of this is, all of these kinds of sort of resources and ideas is what we really wanted to put to use in as part of the diaspora. And this is what happened both, some of this connecting to NGOs, etc., happened through YSS, and it also happened outside of YSS, right? So though some of our participants who graduated from YSS did go and spend a semester or a year or 2 years, and continued doing a lot of extensive work with organizations and activists in India. In the very early beginning of YSS, it was really Mona Chopra who's on this call today, and she was a recent, sort of graduate of Evergreen from near Seattle, and had just returned to New York. There was Raju Rajan, who was an engineer, who was working for IBM, right? But very much, again, sort of progressive left. There was Mridula Udayagiri, who sort of was really helping to plan some of the early YSS, who was a sociology faculty at that time, a student at UC. She just was at UC Sacramento for many years. Sunaina Mehra then joined in. Vijay Prashad was always there, someone we could call on, who would come and be there for several days or whatever sessions we wanted him for. Biju Matthew, who worked with my partner, who also worked with New York Taxi Workers Alliance, was also very involved from the beginning in in YSS. And I think New York City was really sort of a very sort of a space that we could really host something like YSS quite easily. And I think that New York City as a place is also really important to consider. And here I think this is where, some understanding some of the differences of, how summer program is conducted in a place like Houston versus New York City, etc., would be really interesting to talk about. But New York City, again, is a place for different kinds of activism, right? And again, also very visibly, sort of, you can see the very different diasporic communities of South Asian origin. And so the different kinds of activism and organizations that we could introduce participants to quite easily, right? In terms of, if you think about, there was, an organization, youth organization that was called SAYHU. There was Manavi that worked with domestic violence survivors. There was this drum. There were artists of all kinds, right? From really, people doing very interesting sort of, South Asian DJs to, stand-up, performance artists, spoken word, poets and dance. I mean, there was just a lot of, again, a really vibrant space in which we could sort of run this program and create programming that was really interesting and drew people, then young people from all over the country, right? So people came from Middle America, from small towns, from Canada. And, when they would first land and arrive to New York, to the Brecht Forum, which is where we hosted, and I'll say a little bit about Brecht Forum in a moment. The opening of the YSS week, they would sort of realize that, oh, they're not the only one, which is how they would feel often in the small towns or in the places where they were growing up. They would feel like they were the only ones who were sort of asking questions or who felt out of place. And then here they would come to this, arrive in New York City and then find 28 to 30 others who shared some of their same questions or the same desire to be engaged in some kind of social change work, or were asking critical questions. There were, queer youth or a young person, Indian woman with a Black boyfriend who had to hide all these things and, didn't have a place or a community to whom they could sort of share or, process any of these, issues that, that they were experiencing. But here in this space, they could be out, they could talk about these issues, they could claim these identities, right, for the first time. And I think so that became in itself a very radicalizing experience, right? Even before we could even, roll out the curriculum, just, being in this kind of collective space together or with like-minded people itself was very transformative. And I think that was something, again, that, I don't think we quite understood the power of that even when we started this. And it's something that we ourselves sort of learned along, and understood along the way. I could say that in 1998, 99, 2000, I mean, we started our first one actually in 96, which was quite, was actually a flop. And then 97, I think we started, a little bit more seriously. Where we actually reached out very much like the poll you just did, Nisha, just at the beginning of this webinar. Very much like that poll, we started advertising saying, are you interested in social change work? Are you interested in social justice work? Rather than doing a more sort of generic outreach, which is what we had started with in the first year, which really didn't work. And it's when we started doing that very sort of more sort of targeted outreach, and saying that no, if you're interested in social change work and activism, if you're involved in something like this already, then this is the place for you. Come to the summer school, right? And it's really after the first couple of YSSs that it really took off. And I think it was as energizing for the organizers as for the participants, right? And so you could see this in the growth of the collective itself, and new members who joined, who were giving times, their time, every 3 weeks, a meeting, for instance, from the fall right through the spring. And of course, in the summer, it became very intense. And, so from a collective of really starting out with like 4 people, at the max 5 people, we became, it became a planning group of 12 to 15 people, right? Each summer. And there were people who would stay for 2 or 3 years, would leave, but then there would always be new people, and there was always continuity. And I would say one of the big successes of YSS was the participants becoming organizers, as well as people who see themselves as YSS alum, starting their own programs, like we see, now we see in the Bay Area, and we've also in the DC area. And I'm hoping we'll have the Bay Area collective members join us today for some part, so that they can also share their experience and insights. I think I would say that 9/11 was a somewhat of a significant break in YSS, and thinking about YSS and its curriculum, and very much we started seeing that we had to recognize that the South Asian American community also was facing racism, right? Because so much of our and that one is that it couldn't just be about focusing on politics back home, right, and responding to our politics back home, but very much about young people facing racism here, South Asians being part of the anti-war movement that was predominantly white. And then feeling sort of, where is their place in this anti-war movement, the rise of Islamophobia, all of this. And so you really see sort of 2002 becoming sort of a real point of taking stock and making major changes in the curriculum. And, I think our pedagogy, we always try to keep it sort of very interactive and not sort of just talking heads, etc. But I think after 2002 and the 2003 and subsequent curriculum, you can see a real transformation in how it became much more deeply engaging with both politics here and in South Asia, and also trying to also bring about a more South Asian perspective to both the curriculum and as well as the outreach, right? And because otherwise it was predominantly Indian based. And so I think this curriculum has really endured, with some tweaks here and there. And this is something that I can share again and send the link to, because all of it has been documented in detail, I think, by some of the collective members that were part of it in 2003, 4, and 5. And a lot of the work was done by several of them, and which I was not part of that documentation, and I really appreciate that there's a very solid document that has been created. So, but I would say that YSS is the one concrete program that came out of FOIL then, the Forum of Indian Leftists, that ran for 10 years as a volunteer collective. And one of the things we also started off with was this very clear recognition that it's not about money. Like, it's not that we need money to do this kind of work. Certainly space is at a premium in New York. And for this, we are hugely indebted to the Brecht Forum, right? The New York Marxist School gave us space on like a throwaway kind of price. They said, okay, we can afford to pay $250 or $400 for the whole week. And, they were like, okay, that's fine, right? And so we could only take 25 to 30, even though there were, I think there would have been more interest in, there were more applicants. But because the Brecht Forum, the space allowed only that, us to hold, sort of the capacity of that space allowed us to only bring in about 25 to 30 youth participants. We also generated then a network of, what we call friends of YSS, right? So it would be, again, friends who are not directly part of organizing that week, but who are happy to host our out-of-town youth participants, right? We'd say, come with a sleeping bag, we're going to give you an address, and you're going to, sleep there and, find your way to come, in the morning and to the Brecht Forum. And so the Friends of YSS was a big support network where we could really also then host people, free of cost, right? And also then really expand the network of, again, supporters and allies and people that the young people could also connect with and have conversations with. And we, really we would apply for really small grants. I remember Mona and I writing these last-minute grants to North Star Foundation, which is a small New York-based nonprofit that gives to just New York City progressive organizing, right? And there would be really small grants, like $3,000, really not much. And we would really try to also then look at, the applications. We would see who's in financial need and try to also offer a little bit of financial aid to participants who, couldn't really afford to give up, summer work for a week or fly to New York and needed a little bit of help, right? But this was about it in terms of really trying to, the logistics and trying to figure out how to, organize YSS. And once we had these things in place, really it was very much, the goals were very clear to us, from I think year 2 onwards and year 3, that we wanted to be preparing the next generation of progressive left activists in the diaspora, right? Who would be committed to social justice work. And again, I think in this too, I think we were, the success that we experienced was really quite gratifying and quite beyond really our expectations. And the other thing was also very much, about gaining an understanding for young people to gain an understanding of race and racism in America and how South Asians are complicit in it, right? Not simply sort of, the whole sort of notion of South Asians being sort of victims of racism, sort of because, again, that was very much the discourse that the Hindu right would certainly kind of perpetuate. But this was something that we really wanted to complicate and sort of say how South Asians are complicit in sort of anti-Black racism and how, white supremacy sort of utilizes sort of the brown, right? Brown people, in this racial hierarchy. And, those terms actually did not really, we didn't have this vocabulary at that time, anti-Black racism, right? That vocabulary didn't exist, but it was very much part of our orientation and perspective and our understanding. Understanding migration histories of South Asians and the differences of class, caste, gender, and therefore politics and, issues of different diasporic groups, very, very key to, the curriculum. I want to just say a little bit about the curriculum here in terms of, initially we started actually our first very module would often be on power and privilege and unpacking the power and privilege of South Asian, Americans, right? And specifically, I think, Indian Americans, right? And less so, I think Bangladeshi Americans and Pakistani Americans would be, coming from much more working class backgrounds. And so these also would lead to very interesting and different, conversations and a real learning when we would have, again, it would be very few Pakistanis or Bangladeshis or Sri Lankans that we would have, an occasional Nepali, like in the cohort. It was typically, majority Indian Americans. And this was something, again, I think, we tried in the later years to do more work and sort of have that kind of diversity, but we were not, very successful. And so, but what it eventually transformed into the curriculum was part 1 was something that was labeled meticulous examination, right? Which was much more sort of this self-reflexive kind of modules, that would throw up issues of class, caste, US immigration politics, gender, sexuality, religion, nationalism, and so on and so forth, but in a more self-reflexive way. And then part 2 would be then the bridge to developing that would develop a more structural analysis, and that was called What the Fuck is the System, right? And here it was about having a more political economic sort of analysis, bringing in race. And that time, again, we didn't have the vocabulary of really also talking about racial capitalism as such, but it was very much also talking about race and political economy and race and class together, gender and sexuality, and, about of US imperialism and, the nation state, Hindutva, people's movements both here and there, right? And the part 3 of the module was on resistance and revolution, right? And one of those modules on resistance and revolution, that was the very final closing module, would be, about life on the left and how does one live life on the left? How do you pay your bills and at the same time be engaged in social change work, right? So that was also that was often the final closing module. I know you've been interested to sort of know about how did we sort of develop our pedagogy, and and I think there were a few of us who had been to Augusto Boal's Theatre of the Oppressed workshops here, right there in Brecht Forum. We had been lucky enough to do a workshop with Boal. And so we brought some of this understanding of trying to have scenarios, do role plays, storying, develop games on, that was on class and capitalism, on gender and sexuality, on religion, on a whole bunch of things, right? And if you just think about one of our starting modules would often be the history of immigration. And it's a great way to unpack class, caste, gender, right? If you just look at people's own personal family histories of migration. The other big, very specific aspect about the YSS was we would ask in our application for students to talk, define a project that they would want to work on, even after they, after they left YSS, right, left the week-long program. What was it that they would work on either in their community or on their campuses, right? And this was all saying it was 17 to 23-year-olds, because again, it was legal, thinking about legal hurdles. We kind of said, no, it has to be people who, cannot be younger than 17. And the other, I think, high point of, YSS, and holding it in New York City was the August 15th India Day Parade. So we would have the week structured where it would the India Day Parade would be at the very fag end of the week. And here participants in the past would have participated in this pride, in this parade as a point of pride, right? And feel like, yeah, here they are reclaiming their Indian identity. But it's the critical analysis of the week, that left no one in doubt that no, what we need to do is actually go protest this parade. Here they are excluding or banning SALGA, which is a South Asian Lesbian Gay Alliance in New York. They wouldn't allow the SALGA organization to have a float. The Brahmin Samaj of USA would be having its own massive float. And so, it was kind of, the students, all the young people would just immediately say, no, we're going to be out there protesting. And, I do have some pictures that Mona was so kind to actually gather from her archive and send to me. And so there are some pictures. I hope that if we have time towards the end, we'll share of, of the protests at the India Day Parade. And one of the things I want to just, bring to note here is that, I think because many people have asked us about this, is why is it that we didn't have South Asia even in the name, right? We had it as YSS. And in some ways, yes, it's a play on RSS, but that was really not our point at all, right? It wasn't about that it should, a play on RSS, but it was really that we didn't want to have the identity or South Asian identity to be the organizing principle for the summer program. But we wanted actually solidarity to be the key term around which to mobilize and do critical work around, right? And so we deliberately left South Asia. We didn't put South Asia in our branding, so to speak, right? But really wanted to foreground solidarity as and South Asia would be a certain kind of opening to this politics, but solidarity was really the goal, right? I just want to conclude here, and pass the mic on to Eesha, who I'm really excited to hear from, because I want to say that YSS, in a sense, I would say, is the first wave of South Asian youth education in the US, right? And I think the Bay Area with Solidarity Summer, and I'm hoping they're going to be in the house today, was really the second wave of youth education and organizing, and it's today the longest running, right? So I think right now they're going to have, like this summer, they're going to have one that is, a virtual summer school this August. We also have Desi Summer, DCDS, which is now renamed the East Coast Solidarity Summer, that was also part of the second wave. And SAYHU, I would say, the South Asian Houston United, South Asians for South Asia, Houston's for Youth United, yeah. So in my view, they're the third wave of youth-based organizing. And I'm really thinking that from the little bit that I learned about SAYHU, I think SAYHU brings critical new dimensions to youth organizing in the diaspora that I don't think that we're part of YSS, that maybe have built on it, but really, that are really fresh and new dimensions. And also being located in Houston, I think gives them a very unique perspective into what we are contending with in terms of Hindutva in the US, that I don't think that we, could, have had to fully reckon with here in a place like New York, right? And so I really want to give the floor over to Eesha for her to, for us to hear from her. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sangeeta. And it's nice to see you, Virali and Mona. Welcome here with us. I really appreciate all of that history, and I knew some of it, and I did not know all of it about YSS and its origin point. And it's really lovely to hear that, and significant, meaningful to hear it. So South Asian Youth in Houston Unite, we call it SAYHU. So our little call and response is say what, say who. With our young people, we do that. And we started 4 years ago here in Houston, and we are, I would say, in the direct lineage of YSS and East Coast Solidarity Summer and Bay Area Solidarity Summer. And it was, in fact, we have an origin story on our blog, which I'll drop in the chat here. For you all, but we were founded by 6 South Asian women and 1 Black woman here in Houston. Rachel is my partner in SAYHU and my partner in life, and is a professor at the University of Houston. And SAYHU really started when I moved back to Houston, and we were having some conversations about Rachel's students and her South Asian students and how disoriented they were in their South Asian identity in a place like Houston, Texas, where there is a very diverse city, as many of you may or may not know. It is, by some metrics, the most diverse city in the country. It is 25% immigrant. It has a huge transnational population. And in that context, it's also a southern city, southern to the United States, which we in many ways identify as southern. Southern means so many things. In Texas, means so many things to us specifically, but it also is a kind of divestment in social justice education has happened in the South. A divestment in education in general has happened in the South. So in many ways, in order for us to find and engage young South Asian people in Houston, we really needed to have South Asian in the name. And it was an organizing principle for we were talking about Desi Summer, and we're talking about use of the word Desi, and expressly decided not to use it because we wanted to because of the transnational nature of Houston, the transnational nature of the South Asian community here. It's not a term that necessarily resonated, and many of our young people, particularly those not with families of origin in India, found the word Desi alienating to other South Asian identities. So that was an interesting kind of initial conversation that we had around the South Asian. And it was really knowing that those programs had existed in New York and in DC and the Bay Area that kind of brought us to say, well, there's a huge gap here. We have these young people who are interested in a politicized South Asian identity, but have no foothold in where to get that politicization, where to find community. And And we really, we looked at, I had a conversation very early days with Anirvan at Bay Area Solidarity Summer, and you all were so generous in sharing your curricula. And we looked at the curricula and we said, well, this just isn't going to work here in Houston. We just need I think it was Nidula in the comments was asking about place-based organizing and the importance of place-based organizing. We needed our organizing and the identity, the South Asian identity, to be so specifically anchored in the U.S. South. And what that means is we had to sort of start at a different place. We were not necessarily coming together with a fully formed, active left politic in the South Asian community here. Of course, there is some of that organizing. It's very scattered. It was not organized. And so we did not have a community of folks who got together and talked about politics in the US, politics in South Asia. And so we really are building that. That is some of what SAYHU is building. We also, another really important organizing principle for SAYHU is transnational feminism, specifically anchored in the tradition of Black Southern feminism. And so this comes from my grounding and experience at that point, just about 6 or 7 years into being a member of the Crump Feminist Collective, which is a Black Southern feminist collective. And so that was another sort of anchoring for us, was focusing on and being both accountable to and motivated by an analysis of Black feminist, a Black feminist analysis of both the South and of race and gender in our own lives. We also had some of our founding folks were young, recently graduated students from the University of Houston, as well as another professor in sociology and the executive director of our South Asian Domestic Violence Organization, Rachna Kare, who's at Daya here. So we kind of had this group of folks who had clearly identified a need for a South Asian space that was progressive, that was feminist, that was grounded in an accountability to Black Southern organizing and thinking. And we sort of forged a way through that without a clear template, but certainly motivated by the importance of those spaces and motivated by seeing what they had brought and the kind of organizing that happened in New York and in the Bay Area. And so that was an interesting kind of back and forth for us in thinking about, okay, well, we really have to structure this the way we have to structure it. It's not sort of a one-size-fits-all South Asian identity, social justice work, and we had to really forge. And I will say that our curriculum, which later I can show you, I'll drop the link to it. It's all online. We last year made our summer institute a virtual summer institute. So this is our 4th year. That was our 4th year doing a summer institute. That was our initial. We got a tiny little grant. All of us volunteered our time. That supported us with getting space and food and doing outreach and getting people to do our first summer institute. Since then, we have been supported by the Simmons Foundation here in Houston, which really provides us, it's not a nonprofit structure, it's a collective structure, and they provide us with the resources for, not for staff, but for the work that we do. So all of our resources kind of go into materials and space and things like that. We have just brought in a group of interns, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But as you can see, we have in the process of putting our curriculum, putting our entire summer institute online last year, was also our largest, which told us something interesting about the accessibility of the virtual space. We opened it beyond Houston, the city of Houston, to the state of Texas, and we had folks from other places in Texas join us. And we used the opportunity to further kind of democratize the content that we were sharing and make it accessible to our whole community and make it accessible online. So this is entirely, that I just dropped in the link, is our entire curriculum. I think there are a few pieces that maybe aren't on there, but I think these pages are the bulk of our modules here. And you can see we have feminisms, we have zine making, we talk about law and policy, understanding intersectionality. We have a really robust multi-layered module on anti-Blackness, caste, and colorism, which was co-created with Rachel, myself, and Dr. Rekha Subramaniam, who's here at the University of Houston Clear Lake. We have also a preservation project, further in kind of aligned with our work to make South Asians in the US South known. We have an oral history and archiving project and a preservation project, which is another kind of knowledge generation and production to sort of say there are Southern South Asians. It is not the identity of the South that you might traditionally hear. It's not even what you might think of when you think of Houston or you think of Texas, but there is a huge South Asian population here. And we have an active and vibrant reproductive justice conversation going on here, which stems from some of my work, but also the fact that we live in a state where access to reproductive rights is constantly under attack, and the young people that we organize with are very concerned about that. And it's been really quite an important piece of our curriculum. The other thing that I will say about how we're structured, so we are structured as a feminist collective, consensus decision-making, and what that has meant is we have had many iterations, and you'll see in the origin story some of those iterations tracked here. We also have a real challenge of creating space for developing the leadership of the community that we are organizing. So that means young South Asians our curriculum is for, our summer institute is for 18 to 26. And we have really struggled with the parameters around who SAYHU is for, because we made it for this group of young people, and that was who the Summer Institute is for. And then out of the woodwork came 20 and 30 somethings who said, we never got this space. We never had this space in Texas. And can we come to SAYHU? And can it be for us too? And so in response to that request, in 2018, we did a Southern Regional Summit. And we had about 100 people from around the South come to Houston. The Art League of Houston donated space to us. And so in this local art gallery, we had a 2-day summit where we talked about many of these same issues. People brought their children, people brought their parents. It was a very intergenerational space. My own mom and Bua came, which was very interesting. They came to the conversation that we had about anti-Blackness in South Asian communities. To have, my own family members there was like an interesting moment of universes colliding, and that has been really interesting work for me here because my parents are here and my family is here. So to be doing this kind of work after many years away from Texas, back in Texas, has been really kind of making my own understanding of politicization very acute. It is very difficult to do. It's difficult to do this work regardless. It's easier to do it amongst peers. It's very hard to do it with your family. And that has been a lesson that we have all been engaging and learning, particularly in pandemic times when we're having these virtual spaces and people are in their families' homes and they're navigating what it means to do this work. I'd also like to talk a little bit about Texas and particularly Modi's visit here, which was just a couple of years back, and how it's, I see Verali covering her face. I mean, it was really, we knew that there was a strong core of the Hindu right grounded here in the South Asian community of Texas. We did not know how big it was, and we did not know how many sort of webs there were out of it until we started organizing a protest in response to it and saw what emerged from that in Houston. Also not a common narrative of Houston as a site for Hindutva anchored fundraising. I mean, I think we knew some of the financial streams are anchored here in terms of the community of Indians who live here. But that was really interesting and important. And some of our young people in SAYHU, for them, that was their first protest, which was very interesting to see. Another thing that, just to pick up on Sangeeta's naming the kind of politicization of our community, the young people that we work with were, for them, thinking about racial justice and intersectionality has always been a given. This is a group of people that came of age post 9/11. And not only that, but have become politicized in the wake of the murder of Trayvon Martin and Eric Brown, and in alignment with the movement for Black Lives here in the US. And so this has been a really interesting, important tension we've had to negotiate. The challenge of understanding both racial privilege and the costs and benefits of the model minority status that many of them have to negotiate as young people in predominantly white spaces in Texas, or in diverse spaces where they sort of get lumped into an Asian category, which is also something I'd really love to talk about with others who are negotiating what it means for South Asians to be collapsed in an identity politic of Asian identity, which has been happening in interesting ways in the past few months also, since the violence in Atlanta here. And also then dealing with anti-Blackness in the South Asian community. And because our SAYHU space is not exclusively Indian, I think we have a good representation of people whose families are from Pakistan. We have folks who are of Bangladeshi origin, and a few, folks who are from other diasporic points. It means that we also have to do kind of a further step back education and engagement on questions of caste. And so one of the footholds that we have into conversations about anti-Blackness, colorism, and caste is to put those things together, to talk about how they are in interplay, how they are different, and how they leverage each other in important ways. And so our curriculum does that intentionally, and it provides a few important footholds into understanding both how these things are aligned and also how they are not interchangeable. And so this is all organizing work that we are actively engaged in, and that we are sort of forging a path as we go, that was animated in a new way after Modi's visit to the US, and especially as we've been seeing the parallels between Trump and Modi and the way that young people understand what fundamentalism looks like across the diaspora. And that's been an interesting kind of educational foothold for us here too. And I think what's interesting is the important regional specificity, because while there is sort of a disinvestment in education and political education in the South, there also is a long tradition of civil rights organizing led by Black activists and organizers. And our SAYHU space is deeply intentional and aligned in collaborating across racial identity. And we think I learned this in the tradition of Black feminism, is that our modes of accountability across race are very important. And so our spaces are not South Asian only spaces. We do a lot of cross work. We sort of try to talk across racial identity and really live into a practice of building a solidarity politic that moves beyond kind of a touchy-feely, limited intersectionality analysis, but that really asks us to look at what is happening in Houston. Who are we organizing with in Houston? What is our relationship to the Black Lives Matter organizing in our own city, in our own state? And how do we bring that into each piece of our own organizing? We recently had a series of conversations, or the start of a series of conversations about, as you may or may not know, Texas incarcerates amongst the greatest percentage and population of people in the country. in its prisons and jails. And we just had a conversation facilitated by 2 of our community members about incarceration and people who are incarcerated. We did a letter writing campaign. We're trying to sort of intentionally do our own learning and also build some of those threads and cross and multiracial organizing in Houston, which I would say is really, it's something that Southern organizers know, is that the politics will only take you so far if they are not intentionally multiracial and not intentionally solidarity politics, because we are so diffused, we are rendered so diffused by the structures of these Southern states that are directly in the legacy of the Jim Crow South. So we are negotiating that in our own organizing. And we see it show up in these very problematic ways that we then sometimes we're surprised at how diffused people are, how so many South Asians can live in such a diverse city and not know different people of different races. How can that be that they sort of go to school with these communities, but our social networks and our city is so segregated? So what does that mean for us? Where we say with such pride that we live in a diverse city, and yet our political networks are so segregated. I mean, Rachel talks about this around her students in these very diverse classrooms, and yet they have very rarely talked across that difference with each other. And so that's a real function of some of our work, and that's where some of the oral history piece comes into, where they are required to talk to each other. And one very interesting thing happens when they all come together. And I am thinking about the questions in the chat about how to do this kind of organizing in spaces where people are doing it for the first time, or they're negotiating identity in new ways for them. The first thing that happens is that when we bring our SAYHU folks together is that they look for similarities. They are really hungry for, oh, this happens to me too, or I felt like this also in school, and I felt alienated in this way, and they're looking for that connection. And then slowly over the course of time, over our summer institute, they start to see that there are divergences in the South Asian community, that they don't all have the exact same experience, whether it's across gender, national identity, sexuality, all of those things. So then we have to create a container that can hold that solidarity and also be attentive to diversity in our community, and that doesn't gloss over the diversity because they're so hungry for solidarity and a space in which they get to be progressive young South Asians together, and where they're sort of forging very different from, I think, what sounds like the origin points of YSS. I mean, we really get folks who are looking to begin developing a political analysis, who have some sparks of curiosity, who have maybe done some organizing work, but who are really negotiating what it means to be a progressive or radical South Asian, and are forging that together. So our space has to really hold all of that. It has to hold the people who are longstanding organizers and who have a sophisticated political analysis. It has to hold folks who are coming for the first time into the space. And it has to hold the divergence and also the similarity of the South Asian experience in Houston. And so that's both the beauty and the challenge of doing work in this space. And the one last thing I'll say that has been important for us here is part of our feminist politic, but it is that we are, of course, a space that is welcoming of people of different genders and sexualities, but that we work really hard to make sure that we are not merely a space that is tolerant of queerness and different sexualities and gender identities, but that is actually actively affirming, and where those identities around gender and sexuality and queerness are centered. And that, I think, has set us apart from other South Asian spaces. And it was something that was very important to me, having been in progressive South Asian spaces where there was a lot of tolerance, but very little affirmation and very little centering of queerness, of multiple experiences of gender and sexuality. And we have some interesting lessons we've learned from being that space in Houston. It means some people flock to us. It means some people are wary. It means that we have to be careful how we advertise our space, because a lot of these young people particularly in COVID times, live with their families. And we have to be careful of their participation in SAYHU potentially outing them or seeming to out them, or what that means. It's a whole new set of considerations that we are negotiating in this time. And it's something really quite joyful, though, I will say, to have a space in which, last year at our Summer Institute, the participants created their own transgender South Asian channel. We use Slack for organizing in the virtual space, so they created their own space that was just for trans South Asians, many of whom had never met another trans or non-binary South Asian before. And so there's something really radical and transformative about that space, making sure that space exists. So I can stop there and see how we want to do it.
It's such a treat to have Virali here, to have Rachel here, in this conversation. So I'd love if, Virali, you wanted to say something about sort of, what was, what do you think have been sort of, the differences when you're listening to each of these stories, and you were part of YSS. So you know what YSS was about.
Yeah, sure.
How did, Bay Area, shaped up to be a little different, or
well, I think there's a few things. It's so fascinating hearing from both of you to just think through, gosh, the genesis of this work. Both myself and Nupur, who was here earlier, are alums of YSS. So we've both gone through the process of YSS. And when we came out to the Bay Area, we were really struck with the fact that the Bay Area is such a hotbed of activism and organizing, and yet there wasn't really a space for young folks who identified as South Asian to really tease apart everything going on around them, whether they're from here originally, whether they moved here, or transplants. And so the origin of BASE was very much in thinking through, how do we continue to build, certainly locally and regionally, and in fact, BASE does have participants both from the Bay Area, but also from SoCal as well. So it's really got a bit of a state orientation. Even though we've had in the past participants from as far away as Texas before, right? The BASE is actually moving into its 11th year now, which I'm just shocked to see, given that we had the pandemic and that the energy is still there. But I think that's somewhat a testament to the activity that continues to feed it from the Bay Area, because the Bay Area just attracts so many folks of South Asian descent who are interested in living a radical activist life. So I think that's partly why we've had that luck in some ways, is what I would call it. And also, I would definitely chalk it up to that in great part. But then also, we've been really trying, it's the longest running, I think, for now, but we've also been trying to really think about staying power. So I wanted to just mention a few things that I think is really important to any of these types of spaces, which is in thinking about when a group of disparate individuals come together, what is the process that you want to create to really help them just get to know each other, right? Just build trust and build a common vocabulary. And I think that was something that, in the 5 years that I was involved with BASE, that was something that I really started thinking about a lot more. Because to me, the staying power of something like this comes from the relationships that you make in that small amount of time that you then want to carry on in some way, shape, or form. And so we put thought into sort of, how that process, how we can really cultivate that process. The way in which we've done it traditionally, right? And unfortunately, I can't speak to the last few years because I haven't been an organizer, but I can speak to parts of it, because I think there's still parts of it that have continued on. Is we do start with really centering everybody in a history of South Asians in the United States, right? And trying to, and when we talk about that, we don't talk about just Indians, right? We've actually tried to expand the timeline work to include all pieces or all parts and all peoples of the diaspora. And so that turns out to be over and over again every year, both an exercise for some people in confirming things that they already know about the South Asian community in this country, and then surprises over and over again around things that they never knew. And it really creates a sense of history and timeline and place for people in a way that they didn't necessarily have, right? And to Eesha's earlier point, you know, some of the things that we have been thinking about is really how to make that timeline be more inquiry based, right? So we're not just offering the information, but we're also asking the young folks, you know, what's missing and what needs to be included and what's the next step. So it actually evolves from year to year in that process, which has been wonderful to see. It's just gotten huge as part of it as well. But that in addition to really focusing on opportunities for people to really talk through and engage in activities that allow them to really express where they're at and what they're about is something that we've thought about a lot. One example of that is we started an evening of unorganizing sessions where you know, the participants basically are offered a space to actually present on a topic that they want to present on, you know, and they can have anywhere from 15 to 30 to 60 minutes to do it. And so it's you know, midweek, but it's an opportunity for them to decide, you know, what topics they're interested in sharing about that they themselves already have knowledge on, right? So we've tried to create a space where we really invite people to bring their full selves in, knowing very clearly that they are probably, given that a lot of them also are from the Bay Area or have family in the Bay Area, they don't necessarily have that space elsewhere, right? In terms of really being able to bring their full selves everywhere they go. So that's part of the thinking is, you know, how do we really create that safety as much as possible, because there's no full safety, right? But and that sense of trust. The other thing that I wanted to mention is related to that. We also wanted to support the young folks in thinking through what is the next step after this experience of workshops, right? And analysis. And one way we've done that in the past, I can't speak to whether it's still in play, is we actually grouped people into smaller groups and created a group project for them throughout the 5 days. And so for each workshop that we did, you know, there's sort of this organizing 101 type workshop that they had. There would be a space right after it for them to talk in their groups. And they were assigned an actual campaign that's going on in the Bay Area to think through sort of what would be the steps that they would take in this campaign. And in fact, I see Biju walking in the background, Sangeeta, but Biju's actually been a part of helping do this particular workshop in the past at BASE. And then we'll have, you know, a media and communications workshop. And so right after that workshop, they meet in their group and they discuss, well, what is going to be their messaging for the work that they're doing? What is going to be the news headline that they ideally would want if they were going to do some kind of activity? We do a direct action workshop where they understand what is the purpose and the role of direct action in organizing. Why is it so important? Some of that is a little bit outdated. So like I said, I don't know what has really lived on. And the young folks that are coming into the space now are so sophisticated in the sense that they've already had experiences with direct action and protest, especially I think in the last year. I think we're going to see that be the case. And so I feel like part of our responsibility is also thinking through who is organizing the week and who is organizing the experience. So one of the things that we've been really trying hard to do at BASE is really tap folks who've gone through BASE to actually come back and be organizers.
Yeah.
And open that space of organizing to the young folks who are actually still in the thick of a lot of the organizing evolution that's happening, right? So that's part of it, is that we've actually had alums come back and cycle through as organizers, which has been great because it allows someone like myself to step back and really create that that cycle.
I want to invite Rachel in a little bit, yeah, because I'm just looking at the time as well. Virali, this has been really great to hear your insights, but I'm just thinking, you know, I don't know, Nisha, how much time we have, but yeah, I'm going to go.
Half an hour. This is a unexpected gift that's happening right now. So please go with whatever. Yeah, it's such a privilege to have you with us, all of you. So I'm staying quiet. I just want to listen. Yeah. So, yeah.
Because I know some of the people attending also had a couple of questions. But yeah, Virali, if you want to wrap up, and then you can pass on pass the mic on to Rachel.
Sure. So I think the one thing I also wanted to mention is about 5 years ago, it was really clear that we weren't doing a good enough job at really bringing anti-Blackness into the conversation, and our young folks were really asking for it. And I the reason I want to underscore that is I think that that's something that is important for all of us who are doing this work to really think about, you know, how we are really responding and engaging with where the young people are coming from and what's going on, not just in the world, but in their lives in terms of how they're engaging in the work. We're really fortunate in the Bay Area to have this incredible history of Black organizing as well that we've been able to tap into. And there's also been a very strong force of Asians for Black lives here as well, which I think is partly why a lot of the young folks were bringing that into the space as well. But anyhow, I just wanted to underscore that piece of it as well, because I know that's, you know, that's definitely a living component of what's happening here in this country. And it's also, you know, worldwide on many levels too. And certainly related to that, we have a very strong anti-caste set of organizers and organizations based here that has also been a part of that, which, you know, I don't know if y'all saw, but, you know, there's a caste discrimination case going on here in the Bay Area now. And it's definitely a conversation we've been having over the last 5 years as well, along with the anti-Blackness work that we've been trying to really engage in. So I'm going to wrap it up with that. And if there's questions, I'm happy to stick around too. So.
No, that's wonderful. That is so, so valuable. And I want to, really invite Rachel in to offer some reflections, remarks, because I think SAYHU is like now the new wave that I feel like this is where the next generation of organizing needs to move towards, that is more interracial, and, and also, to see like, to have leadership of an organization of this kind of youth program that is interracial and queer, I think is again something that's so phenomenal and unique. Yeah. So please, Rachel, thank you so much for being here.
Sure, I'll do my best. My internet's a little spotty this evening, but there were a couple of things I wanted to add to this wonderful conversation. It's really exciting to see the overlap. One of the things, as a professor of gender studies and comparative cultural studies at University of Houston, I was really thinking about both how to connect all of the few South Asian students I would find in the humanities, how to connect them with one another, and also how to give them language that they weren't getting in the other fields that their families were really tracking them into. So how do they talk about their experiences or intergenerational experiences of immigration and race and identity? And so that, for me, that was a motivator to, also I kept saying to Eesha, oh, you really should talk to my student about this. And my students would say, how do you know these things about my community? And, you know, but we had various experiences that we've been learning with Eesha's own family and our friends in Houston. So that was one piece. For me, I was motivated to try to apply feminist theory to this kind of project, which I think makes it different from some of the other existing projects. What would it look like? What could I take the opportunity to learn from Eesha about her work with Black feminists and the work I have been doing with South Asian feminists who have mentored me. So I think in our archival project that we've been developing, we're starting to highlight these Black and South Asian collaborations. And so I wanted to add to the conversation that, you know, a lot of SAYHU is like, oh, to my students, you want this thing, let's try to make it. You know, we have these networks, both within the university, and then Eesha had more national networks. Let's point you to different communities and folks to collaborate with. And then also I was learning more around digital humanities and what was possible with publishing online, from moving from a blog to creating the curriculum, but what would it mean to have a website, to use social media? And all of that felt experimental, but really important to how we built up the community. And then of course, during the pandemic, we really saw the fruits of our labor of already having these spaces where people could find us. And, you know, as Eesha was saying, they didn't necessarily want to affiliate with or associate with SAYHU, but they were also drawing on resources. Things like, where can you find a South Asian mental health provider? How can you connect with DAIA around domestic violence? And who, you know, local practitioners that would be safe to go to for queer youth. And so we started to do even, you know, community surveys within our community. What are the needs that the young people want? Because initially the intent was not for us to lead a project. It was really to create a space where young people could step into leadership. And I think, you know, 4 years in, we've had all of the experiences of like the building trust that Raleigh was talking about, and this kind of growth and figuring out what direction we want to take things in. And now we're just trying to empower youth to engage and feel ownership over this community now that they've built relationships. You know, after growing up and being taught, like, you can't trust X community, or you can't trust people outside of your family. How do you build trusting relationships where, you know, this like feminist community can be a priority for you? And that for me was like a question and a challenge in this larger project. And so we're seeing this year with our largest number of interns this summer, like, you know, 5 youth really taking the lead and building archives, doing oral histories. You know, we're seeing what might be possible and hoping then to hand that over to them so they can make it what they will. And I'll add the blog link here because I think the blog became
I dropped it just now.
Oh, great. A space of publishing, you know, where you could really start to see the diversity of voices that we have in our community. And for me, that was a priority because as a scholar, it was a priority to archive there. And I was working with graduate students doing public history. And so like developing our own methodologies for this unique community was also an experiment and important to the work we were doing. So.
That's so wonderful and so rich and so much to learn actually from the work you are doing, both what Virali and Rachel, what you've shared, and Eesha. I know Firoz has been waiting in the wings. He has some questions. Firoz is a comrade in Montreal. And, you know, we also know each other through ICWI. And I don't know, Mridula is still here. did she have to leave? She had a question, right? Eesha.
She's had many questions, but I think we heard answers to almost all of them through the speakers, either directly or indirectly. So are you ready to open this up for questions, Sangeeta?
Yeah.
Did you, yeah? Can we, great. Yes, I'm also going to ask Mudit while people, who have, and I hope you'll ask questions to each other as well, but we do have a slide ready with the photos you wanted us to look at. Maybe that will also prompt some provocations. So Firoz, I'm just going to...
Really, that's going to be like down memory lane for you, like a nostalgia trip to see some of the pictures.
Yeah. Sangeeta said she wanted me to ask questions as well, but all of you have already spoken to them. So maybe I'll just take a minute to highlight some of the things that I sort of wrestle with as an anti-oppression educator in the academy and beyond, right? I mean, today we're talking about transformative well, we're not. Rachel's just talking about what's happening in her classroom and so forth. So I'm sort of, I mean, there are a couple of things that I heard that I hope our audience members heard as well. One is the importance of action, right? So knowledge alone, information alone is not enough, right? So I mean, you can get this from Paulo Freire or any number of Black feminists or whoever, the idea of praxis, right? And Sangeeta, you talked about it, and every single speaker thereafter has emphasized that when we create these radical spaces, we have to give our students, whether they're youth or anyone else, opportunity and space to act as well, and to act collectively. So to put these ideals of solidarity based on difference and not sameness into practice, right? If we want to build, I hate the word resilience, the corporate academy has sucked it dry, but I mean, if we want to build a sustainable spaces and networks of activism. So thank you everyone for emphasizing that. I also always have concerns about safety and trust, and more broadly, the affective dimensions of what we're doing. I was, my 15 years in the United States added a dimension to my politicization, anti-oppression educators from different races, genders, classes, and someone, I don't know who, but maybe it was in an interdialogue, group dialogue space, but I was reminded that in some ways the work we're doing is fundamentally destructive. We're pulling the carpet out from the people we're working with. And these are, I mean, all of you, also what you have in common is you're working with people who want to be part of change. So we're not talking about educating Sanghis or RSS members or white supremacists, right? But even so, these people come into our space, they trust us, and then we go about the work of deconstructing their world as they know it, right? And even how they look at themselves. And so that has been the most challenging for me, right? How to do that in a respectful way, to ask them to trust us enough to walk this walk where we examine power and privilege and complicity, and also celebrate the hope and the possibility of doing this work together. So thank you. We want, if anyone wants to comment further on that, that would be great. I'm just throwing it out there on, how we do this work respectfully and safely, as many of you said. I guess, so the one question I have, and for anyone who does want to answer it, is what work do we have to do on ourselves as educators?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that question about who the SAYHU participants are. I think there is a wide range, and I think there has been each cohort is different, and we do a summer institute, but we also do programming throughout the year. So in many ways, we build upon what comes in the summer institute through different kinds of community gatherings and conversations throughout the year. And so the people that come to SAYHU, I mean, it's a range, and also they disclose their caste backgrounds at different points. Once there is a deeper set of trust. Sometimes we hear about people's diverse caste backgrounds, which they don't always walk in the door with. And I think that's important also when we're thinking about the longevity of our organizing, and to Virali's point about trust building. So we have a strong representation of people who are, whose families are from India and Pakistan. We've had folks who have represented Sri Lanka, Nepal, and we know that there are some Indo-Caribbeans in the area. We've tried this in our community members. We've had some folks who are Indo-Caribbeans come to our community events. And the biggest thing that I think we have work to do on is actually understanding how to navigate caste in Houston. Because I think there are codes that are shifting and changing. And when you have something like Modi's rally happen here, communities that may have been feeling safer or willing to engage will go further underground. And that is something we're negotiating, and we're going to have to pay close attention to here. And that's really something that I think we want to do work on. Although what I will say is that we have a range of class backgrounds, and sometimes those overlay on to caste backgrounds, and sometimes they do not. And we are learning and trying to offer folks ways to communicate their identities and to make it a safe. There is often in South Asian spaces an unwillingness to talk about working class identity. There is a model, like there's sort of an assumption that everybody comes from a certain level of education, and that can be very alienating to folks who do not come from that space. And we have several of those folks come through our Summer Institute, and finding each other has been the core there. We have several folks in our Summer Institutes who grew up in Black neighborhoods or in Latino neighborhoods, who then who have a very particular experience of Texas, very different from those that grew up in places like Sugar Land, which are predominantly white, suburban, upper class. And so we have this range of South Asians, and our challenge is to create a space, like I was saying earlier, that allows for those differences to emerge and allows for people to be able to talk in a way that they feel safe doing so, to Virali's point about trust. And also to identify with identities that they have been told they should hide. That's another piece of doing cross-caste work in the U.S. Is that there's a lot of silence and a lot of silencing, and we are negotiating that ourselves. Whereas in kind of hushed conversations, people will say, "This, I also have this experience. I also have this caste experience," but that's not something they're going to stand up and say in a room full of South Asians, some of whom are upper caste, upper class folks. And so we have work to do inside our own South Asian community around that. And that's a version of answering your question, Eesha, about the work we have to do. For me, I have this robust experience working on anti-racism around anti-Blackness. And I have a lot of my own learning and work to do around casteism in my own understanding of my South Asian identity. And the way that I'm negotiating that is by trying to have those learnings in public so that I can have them alongside the young people so I say, here's what I know, here's what I don't know, this is what my caste experience is. And I just try to do it out loud so that we don't further silence. And that means I have to have a degree of vulnerability, and I have to be willing to be told that, this is something you don't understand, you should not talk about. Here's something we need you to talk about. It's actually giving me a deeper understanding of what it means to be an active ally, a co-conspirator, and to think more robustly about my role. Some of us who are South Asians in the US have a very strong identification with people of color and people of an oppressed background. And those of us that have upper caste backgrounds have to renegotiate some of that around caste. And so my strategy has been to try to do that out loud as much as possible and be willing to, make some messes and figure it out as I go, because otherwise it will just stay underneath. It will remain a thread underneath our work and has the potential to really render it unstable.
I'll add that, we're doing all this modeling that we don't realize that, young people are looking to us. So one thing we've learned about just being out as a queer partnership is that, you know, our heterosexual youth participants are still looking to us for what does a healthy relationship look like? What are our communication skills? How do we mess up in public or, you know, resolve conflicts? And so we're learning all of that as folks who don't have our own children, you know, sometimes we were like, what is this parenting moment that we have, you know, but also how do we hand over leadership? Like our own growth is like, okay, we're mastering this thing, but how do we, you know, let it be okay to let young people lead, even though we might have come in with a vision and put a lot of energy into it? I think that's really the growth for this kind of project. So we have, with Dia, we have young people talking about the Summer Institute in a couple of weeks on their social media, and really like giving them opportunities, which at first they hesitate, some of our youth, because they're ambivalent about their identities as like social justice leaders. The ones who are ready and out there leading, they're often leading in political campaigns because that's a very Texas model. So they have another model. And then this model within SAYHU is, as Eesha said, it's like kind of bringing in who wants to be in the space, you know, who we can offer them what we can offer them and help them connect to this broader movement.
That was so wonderful to hear.
Would anyone else like to respond to any of the questions on the table so far?
I just wanted to say,
Diyali, please.
I think that there's this fascinating phenomenon that happens, at least it had been happening at base, where, you know, we were also getting this wide range of participants, right? And especially when it came to class backgrounds. And you know, we are Silicon Valley here, right? So we have a fair number of very privileged young folks who came with activist leanings. And so I think part of the work that you were talking about, Nisha, is, you know, really helping people to deconstruct, right? And also understand the point of privilege that they come into a space with, and also where they don't have that privilege, where they thought they did, right? So just reminding them that, you know, actually there are some spaces and there are some ceilings and there are some constraints that you have just grown into, right? But from my perspective as an educator, related to what Eesha was saying around being vulnerable and also thinking through your own set of privileges and your own renegotiating yourself as you learn more about yourself, right? It was so connected to watching these youth understanding their own points of privilege or oppression, right? And feeling incredible humility in what I was trying to do for them that I'm also doing for myself at the same time, right? So there's this deep connection between the two questions or the 2 points that you made, Nisha, which is how do we work to help these young people think through identity and move beyond identity to that solidarity ethic, right? And then also, what is the work we have to do as well in this process as we're moving them there, right? And I feel like, you know, I would have my own points of judgment around the youth coming into the space who are coming in from incredible places of privilege, and I would have to check myself, right? Because there's so many points in which people are interacting with society that just if you have class privilege, for example, is not the only point in which you are engaging with society, right? So anyhow, I just think that that's a really deep process as someone who is engaging in this work year after year after year. And yeah.
These are the lovely photographs.
around education, it's like, how do we also make these interventions? Because youth want to know these things, they're just not getting more information. So where do they look for information to understand? Because they know that their values don't necessarily align with their parents, and family members, but they also don't know how to enter into the conversation. So we did have a productive couple of book group conversations about Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste, which was like an easy entry point for folks. But we also then, of course, find people doing activism around caste don't have the same education around anti-Blackness and race, and like specific to context, and vice versa. And then like also trying to locate ourselves in the South and understand what this culture looks like. It also does look like a particular type of neoliberal structure that has been tradition here. So yeah, all of those pieces. So I try with the entry point of educational tools and sharing a lot of resources. And it's not always clear, which young people engaged will take those up. But one of the reasons we have that curriculum published more publicly is that people in their 20s and 30s also wanted that information.
Yeah, actually, in the YSS later iterations, we realized we need to have actually a whole component on religion and sort of a progressive critical take on religion. Because you're right, the young folks are looking for that, and otherwise they're only going to get the Hindu right version. And what I think is happening now, Eesha, when you're talking about them coming into the coalition, how they're really desperate now to make Hindu phobia like the language that is sort of equivalent to Islam, right? And I think, yeah, people who really don't know better are sort of buying that, I think administrators in our universities, don't know how to combat now the Hindu phobia language and framing. And yeah, white folks, Black folks, they don't know how to rebut that. And so we are going to have to find a way to help make that happen. Yeah. But it's a really, complex terrain right now. But thank you so much. I know we've stayed like way past. Is it like the 2-hour mark?
Well, yes, just about. But really, I mean, it's such a gift that all these are, Virali and Mona and everyone joined. Rachel, you joined and you shared. So we couldn't have done justice in anything less. And I think, I know this last question was getting people down a bit, but it's not for me, because this conversation, that's precisely the point of this conversation, isn't it? We're documenting what we've done, we're reflecting on what's worked. And as I heard Angela Davis say when she came to Colgate University for our annual race lecture a while ago, somebody asked, a student asked, when can we stop fighting, right? It was such a poignant question. And this is again a question, that's why I always reflect on affect and these, because fatigue and burnout and vulnerability, these are all very real things if we plan to continue doing this work, right? And not blaze in and blaze out. And Angela Davis just smiled and said, you're not, right? La luta continua, as the MST say in Brazil. And she said, and the only other thing she said is, we'll win this one, and then we'll wake up tomorrow morning, and I'm paraphrasing, I think she said something over the next hill, but there'll be another fight to be fought. So this is so incredibly important that we've made the time to come together, to talk, to reflect. Thank you so much. Stay strong, stay well, stay safe.
Thank you to Mona Chopra, who stayed through the... She just sort of joined in. She was the one who compiled all the pictures and sent me. There were many more.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful picture.
Yeah, thank you,
They're
Mona.
so great.